Dr. Dieter de Klerk from the School of Arts, University of Kent. Over to you.
Welcome to Stories, Wellbeing and Business, Finding Meaning in COVID-19 Disruption. So I'm Dieter, I'm a lecturer in film and media studies. I'm going to be talking about well-being and business and COVID-19. I'm going to do so against a background of some of the research I've been doing around comedy and stories and art in general to do with well-being. I'm going to be having 4 sections today. So in each of these sections, which I think will last about half an hour each with some interaction, I'm going to be asking these questions: what is well-being? Why does it matter for business and in professional context? And what challenges does COVID-19 pose? How can the arts contribute to coping with COVID-19? So we're going to be talking about different kinds of coping and how arts can support us with different kinds of coping. And then we'll kind of move towards stories, especially to kind of help us get a grip on disruption. We'll be talking about one of the key aspects of why it's so difficult to deal with COVID-19 is a sense of a loss of control. And so we're going to try and re-establish a sense of control through stories. And then, what story are we going to tell about COVID-19? I'm going to end with some ways of kind of thinking through telling stories. So I'm going to try and make it interactive throughout the webinar, so it's not just me talking for 2 hours or an hour and a half. And you'll see I will ask you, so you can contribute through the chat, or if you want to at those moments, you can also unmute yourself and answer. So hopefully by the end, I mean, this is an introductory session, but hopefully participants will be able to reflect on the importance of well-being in a professional context, understand a little bit more what it is and why it matters, try and distinguish and evaluate when different kinds of coping might be appropriate in different kinds of situations. We'll break down stories, analyze how they work to create meaning and help us get a grip on a situation, and then hopefully employ and use stories, narrative arts as a resource to manage well-being in this difficult situation. Okay, I would like to start maybe by asking people, you don't have to share, but we're probably a pretty diverse group of people. So maybe in the chats, or if you're happy to just unmute yourself, what is your current relationship with arts and stories? Like, do you create some art, or do you just enjoy watching, reading? It'd be really nice to hear just some ideas from people. So we've got somebody who works in arts.
I work at the Higgins Museum in Bedford. I'm an ex-alumni, University of Kent, actually, a history graduate.
Oh, great.
Yes, I saw this through LinkedIn. But yeah, so it's really interesting. We've been collecting some contemporary collecting of COVID-19 narratives locally in Bedford, and photographs and artwork and all of that sort of thing. So this seems really relevant to that. And yes, we're just looking at how we might be able to reopen the museum. Unfortunately, infection rates in Bedford are still quite high, so we're still just monitoring that at the moment. But yeah, that's sort of why I'm here and what I'm coming to with it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's really great.
So yeah, I suppose I'm I'm biased because I work in the arts, so I do stand-up comedy, which is why I know you. And yeah, kind of I sort of want to use sort of stand-up as an art form in order to sort of help people build their kind of communication, but using creativity in order to build that connection and talk about mental well-being rather than mental illness.
Excellent. Okay, so thanks for sharing. It's great to hear people from different professional contexts, especially professional contexts which are really relevant to the topic. So let's talk a little bit more about the way I'm going to be talking about the arts today. So I'm going to be talking about arts as artifacts. So whether it is a stand-up comedy performance or it is an exhibition in a museum, it's something that somebody made intentionally for a particular kind of purpose. And we usually can analyze what a particular art form is trying to do by unpacking the way it's designed. The design of art signals what they are useful for. So in that sense, arts are a little bit like hammers. So hammers are human-made objects. They are designed by people on purpose for a particular kind of purpose, usually banging nails into a wall. And how do we know that? Well, if you look at it, now imagine you've never seen a hammer, or imagine like you're an archaeologist and you're working thousands of years in the future, and hammers have ceased to exist, but you find this object from the 21st century and try and figure out what people did with it. You would look at how it was made. You would see it has this wooden handle, its metal head. You would probably figure out by its design what it was designed to do and what we can use them for. So hammers, and it kind of depends a bit on their design. You have to design a little bit different. They might have different functions. If you've got a bigger hammer, you might be able to make this big path on the right bottom side. You know, if it's a nice shiny hammer, we call it a gavel. You know what I mean. So hammers, like arts, have a particular kind of design, which allows you to do particular kind of things with them, but not everything. So, for example, fixing a television using a hammer, that's not a great idea. That's just because the design of hammers don't allow for it. Also, fixing a television is probably not something that you should try and do using a hammer. So this is kind of what I want to think about. And I think it's probably one of the key ideas I would like to get across today, that we could think about arts almost like they're complex hammers, that we can actively use them for certain purposes. So even if you're not actively creating arts, you can still do something with arts which may have been created by somebody else. In that sense, it's like a hammer almost. So somebody will, for example, create a particular kind of film with a particular kind of purpose, and then you might be able to use it for that purpose. But also, because it's designed in a certain way, it might have certain unintended uses that the person who made it didn't even think about. But because they made it in a certain way, you can use it that way. So if we go back to hammers, very useful but unintended use of hammers is that you can use them to open beer bottles. Now you can't do just anything you want with hammers. You know, you could try and eat soup with a hammer, that's not going to work. But because it's designed in a certain way, you can open beer bottles with it, even though that's not strictly speaking what it's designed for. So I would like us to think about the arts as artifacts that we can analyze, and we look at their design and we see basically what we can do with them. And I think that we can often do more with the arts than we think. And I'm going to be not just exclusively be talking about stories or narrative art, but especially talking about narrative arts. I see somebody always uses hammers to eat their soup, which proves me wrong. So there are different kinds of media in which you can tell a story: a novel, a film, etc. A narrative is an artifact that's designed to tell a story. So The Lion King is narrative. It tells the story of how Simba becomes king of the Pride Lands. Tiger King tells a very different kind of story about, you know, the crazy life of zookeeper Joe Exotic. And much like we can use hammers to bang nails into the wall, or if you're very creative, even eat soup with them, we can use, you know, an artifact like Tiger King, for example, to relax, to learn more about the world. But I think we can also kind of use them towards our well-being, you know, relax, coping, framing a difficult situation. And I think one of the ideas I also want to get across today is that it's, even when you're just watching something, your engagement with the arts doesn't necessarily need to stop after you've watched or watched the film or read a book or played a game. You can adopt and adapt strategies that were introduced in those stories to support your well-being, also in a professional context. And this is what hopefully I'll be getting across today. So, a final note on evidence. I can say all this stuff about the arts. There's different kinds of evidence, and I'm going to kind of bring it back to hammers. I'm going to be talking mostly about the design of the hammer or the artifact. I'm going to be analyzing stories, and I'm going to be analyzing films or games with you. I'm going to explore what they are designed to do, and because of that, what else we can use them for. There are other people who work at universities who don't work in School of Arts like myself, but who might work in fields like psychology or communication studies that might establish like what do people actually do with hammers, and they might measure how efficient hammers are to bang nails into the wall. So if I unpack the analogy, there are people who might study how effective and efficient the arts are in processes of recovery. So that's not the kind of research that I'm doing, but I will draw on it, and I will refer to it in order to support the arguments I'm going to be putting forward today. Okay, so every time I get this up, it is me explicitly asking if you've got questions or thoughts. So I'm trying to monitor the chat as we go along, so please put any questions in there as well. But if at this point you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and just ask them. Okay, so what is well-being? Why does it matter for business organizations and professionals? And what challenges to well-being does COVID-19 pose? Now, what I would like to do is I would like to take a moment for people to maybe share a line or two about each of these questions in the chat function. So we'll take maybe a minute, and it would be good to see what people's initial thoughts about these questions are, about these three questions. What is well-being? Why does it matter for you in a professional context? And what challenges does it pose? So no need to get personal, but just kind of thinking about putting some thoughts down. And just to stress, there are really no wrong answers here. I think what I'll be trying to do here today is unpack some intuitions we already have about this. So it would be nice to see some of these intuitions. So one interesting idea of well-being is mental background noise and how well you're coping. Exactly, yeah, that is really important. So today we are going to be unpacking what coping means in some more detail. Yeah, the idea of keeping you functioning is indeed really important. Yeah, dealing with situations, managing that. Yeah, so physical and mental balance, exactly. So these are indeed really important aspects of well-being, which we're going to be unpacking a little bit more. Indeed, COVID-19 means stresses, strains, and I think we're going to be talking about managing those. All right, thank you very much for sharing these intuitions. I think this is very useful as well, because not just for me, but I think also hopefully for other people who are in the webinar, to kind of see what other people are thinking about as well, because it's obvious that we are sharing many intuitions, and I think also questions and concerns. Okay, so please do feel free to keep sharing in the chat function. I'm going to move on and start unpacking this notion of well-being, building on your intuitions. So one way, and a very influential way of thinking about well-being, is this notion of subjective well-being. So we as the subject, individual, and it's to do with how we evaluate our life. And typically there's two main components in subjective well-being. It's basically what we feel. So the frequent presence of positive and pleasurable feelings like enjoyment, happiness will be an important factor in well-being. Stress, anxiety, low mood, if you struggle with these kinds of emotions, often that will have a negative impact on your well-being. But it's not just about feeling, and this is something really important that I want to get across today. It's also about thinking, and it's also about kind of evaluating how your life is going, life satisfaction. So I'm going to introduce, I guess, a research assistant, BoJack Horseman. My students really like BoJack Horseman, and BoJack Horseman is it's a cartoon, and BoJack Horseman is somebody who used to be in a sitcom in the 1990s called Horsing Around, which is basically a parody of Full House. So it's like a feel-good, happy sitcom, and he's kind of like, he should be really happy in his life, but he's not. And he's talking about, that something is missing.
I think the show's actually pretty solid for what it is. It's not Ibsen, sure. But look, for a lot of people, life is just one long hard kick in the urethra. And sometimes when you get home from a long day of getting kicked in the urethra, you just want to watch a show about good, likable people who love each other. Where, no matter what happens, at the end of 30 minutes, everything's going to turn out okay. Because in real life, did I already say the thing about the urethra?
Okay, what he's trying to get at, I think, is that a life of well-being, a good life, is not just a life in which you're not constantly kicked in the urethra. It's not just a life without pain and a life with pleasurable feelings. It needs like another dimension. And this is what we're going to get at. I'm not going to be using a lot of jargon, hopefully, today. This might be the only time. So we can, in the literature, there's often two kinds of well-being, or two kinds of dimensions of well-being. And the one is to do with feelings of pleasure, so hedonic well-being. So I'm going to call this warm bath well-being. So this is like the idea that maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain is something that is important to our well-being. So what BoJack Horseman describes is obviously, the metaphorical kick in the urethra is, the opposite of this kind of warm bath well-being. But what I'm going to be talking about the most today is a sense of eudaimonic well-being. That means happiness, but it's from Greek, and it really means something along the kinds like achievement, and it's to do with personal growth, and it's realizing your full potential as an individual, but also I think as an organization. And I think what COVID has done, I think it's definitely disrupted our kind of, it's definitely not a warm bath. But I think it also poses a real challenge of like, where am I going as an individual, but where is my organization going as well? And this is seriously disrupting what we had planned, and is a challenge in our journey to realize our full potential. So this is what we'll be exploring in more detail. So it's commonly accepted that when we talk about well-being, and we talk beyond feeling, the idea of fulfilling your individual and social potential. I'm just going to refer to this source here that you might find interesting. This is the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Arts, Health and Wellbeing. So it's a cross-party parliamentary group, that did a report in 2017 about the contributions to arts, health and well-being. It's freely available online, and it actually indicates some really interesting ways in which the arts contribute to health and well-being. For now, I just kind of highlighted a few concepts in bold, which I think were also already shared intuitively in the chat, that these are the kinds of things that well-being is all about. So what we're going to be investigating today is how the arts can contribute to this kind of well-being, just beyond feeling. So this kind of feeling of achieving, that well-being has to do with personal growth and achievement, is also something that we see reflected in research which has investigated universal factors for subjective well-being. So obviously food, shelter, safety, which are things that we associate with a kind of warm bath well-being, are absolutely crucial to our well-being. But we expect also richer things, competency, autonomy, personal freedom, which are exactly dimensions that we can achieve in our professional lives, and which COVID has challenged. Another thing to be aware of is that, so for the time being, I've been talking about subjective well-being mostly, so the well-being of the individual, but we need to think about well-being as integrated in our larger social structures. So it might be our relationships with our family and friends, but I think more to the point of what we're talking about today, within organizations as well. And there is, you can't see the well-being of the individual as distinct from the well-being of the organization. I think, I think people were already referring to how difficult COVID-19 has been for us as individuals. So we bring this with us in the organization. So if the organization can think about creating opportunities for the individual to have higher well-being, this is also going to impact the well-being of the organization in a positive way. So this is, I guess, a holistic sense of well-being. By holistic, I mean there are multiple dimensions and they all interrelate. So this is from the All-Party Parliamentary Group's inquiry. So this was a creative activity undertaken outside of work. This was a study in the United States, was improving recovery from work strain and enhanced work-related performance. And they were talking about things like reading groups and possibilities within organizations for individuals to engage with the arts, which enhanced their work performance and also kind of help them to recover from work strain. So something to maybe keep in mind. So this is kind of my opening bit about what well-being is. And now for the rest of the session, we are going to delve more deeply into the challenges posed by COVID, and then how we can use the arts to respond to those challenges. I think for me at the moment, and I'm inviting people maybe to share things on the chat as well, if they have any ideas they want to add. But it's like, this sense of achievement well-being, we're kind of, especially in Western culture, we're thinking about ambitions and desired goals. And I think especially in a context of business and a professional context, that's what we associate well-being with, what we want to achieve, and about realizing our potential as businesses and individuals. So if anybody kind of at this point, you can unmute your mic at this point or share something in the chat if you want to add something to what's been said before we move on. You're very welcome. Okay, so do share in the chat if you feel like it. I'm going to move on to, now that we've got a sense of different dimensions of well-being, how COVID challenges it. So this is a very recent study that was done around the outbreak of COVID-19 in China. So not a surprise that 74%, that the researchers measured a 74% decline in overall emotional well-being when the pandemic had started. Now, what's really interesting is that people who thought they had more knowledge about the pandemic were able to manage their emotional well-being better. So it didn't even matter whether they had actual knowledge, but just thinking that they had knowledge made a huge difference. And the researchers introduced the hypothesis that this is because when you have knowledge about something, you have a sense of control. And I think that this is really important when we come to talk about COVID, because it has disrupted our control. Like when we're in a professional context, usually, you know, we're on top of things and things are going well. And I think for everybody, COVID-19 presented such an, you know, unprecedented challenge that all of a sudden, you know, there were moments where we weren't on top of it anymore. And I think it's kind of trying to regain a sense of control in a situation that is actually quite beyond our control. So the advice here is, you know, approaches that boost a sense of control can attenuate detrimental effects of an outbreak on happiness. So if we kind of boost approaches that help us get a grip on it, then we might be able to manage our well-being better. I'm getting a really interesting question here about what about misinformation on social media. I think this is a really important question. I think often misinformation on social media is making people panic more. And I think so that misinformation might give us the idea that we are less in control. But I think what this research suggests is, yeah, you know, some misinformation might sometimes be helpful. This is not what I'm going to suggest today, but there is indeed an interesting way to kind of unpack control from truthfulness. Okay. Oh, sorry. I think I have moved a bit too fast. The Zoom is sometimes a little bit unwieldy with the PowerPoint. So the control is so important to well-being. So this is from research around key factors in our work environment that are related to a sense of personal well-being. And they all have to some extent to do with a sense of kind of being in control. Decision latitude just means like the ability and the extent to which you are able to have control about decisions, that decisions aren't constantly made for you. Autonomy, of course, you know, being able to act as an individual, and freedom of choice. So what is really a recipe for disaster in terms of well-being is when you get very high demands in a job context and you've got little sense of control. This might be, for example, if an organization is going through some restructuring, which might be the case in the context of COVID, and, you know, ideas of redundancy or procedures of redundancy are a recipe for disaster. But also I think in general, COVID-19 has forced us all to adapt and, you know, put in extra work for a situation that we didn't have much control about and still don't have full control about. And it's looking very likely that it is going to be the case for some time. So this is something we, I think, need to be really aware of. So I think this is going to be a key message from me today, is thinking about how we can use the arts to get a sense of control, and in a better way than I think, you know, people in the chat are very usefully kind of talking about social media and being critical there. So we'll think about better ways, I think, of using the arts. This is just to reiterate the point. So the Whitehall studies by Michael Marmot, they established indeed how important control was, he distinguished between different categories of workers, so managers and clerical staff and other kinds of workers. And the less control you had, the more you were at risk of adverse health or even death. So I think I can't stress it enough. So it is about re-establishing controls in processes of illness, and of course COVID-19 is an illness, and I think, you know, we can think about it also kind of as a symbolical illness which threatens the health of an organization, not just the kind of physical health of individuals. So it is thinking through how we can get a sense of control and mastery over our environment. So this is the way I've now set up the webinar for the rest of what will follow. We will be looking at how we can use the arts to regain a sense of control and restore well-being. So COVID-19 is disrupting our professional goals and professional targets. It puts strains on our professional performance. So this kind of disruption, like how can we regain a sense of control and how can we use the arts? Okay, I'm briefly kind of pausing here in case anybody wants to add something, unmute their mic, or wants to share something in the chat or ask a question. Okay, it seems like we're probably ready to just move on. So, okay, here we come, I guess, to the where we start actually thinking about how the arts can contribute to coping with COVID. So here I'm going to talk about mental well-being, and this is something that people were already referring to intuitively, that well-being has something to do with mental health and well-being. And what's really interesting, so this is from Mind.org, so the mental health charity Mind. They're talking about coping with daily life. Poor well-being makes it more difficult for us to cope. So this notion of coping is really important when it comes to well-being and mental well-being. I just want to kind of make just a side note. I guess it depends on how richly you define health, but I think we can distinguish well-being from health. Of course, if we have bad health, that is going to pose a significant challenge to our well-being, to our achieving our goals. But we can't unpack, you know, well-being is broader than just having good physical and mental health. And in that sense, I think this is important for us maybe to consider that, you know, well-being is not just getting rid of COVID-19 and its impact on our organizations and our professional lives. You know, well-being is more than the absence of COVID-19, and this is kind of what we're going to be exploring. So what we'll do now is we're going to unpack what coping is, and I'm going to introduce a particular kind of model of coping, which I think is interesting for us then to kind of establish how we can use certain coping strategies, especially that we can find in the arts, and how they would work in particular kind of situations. So if you want me to kind of, this gets a tiny bit theoretical, so please do let me know in the chat if there's anything that remains unclear. But coping is a relationship between yourself as an individual and what's happening in your environment. So coping, the need for coping occurs when a situation happens that we don't have the resources to deal with. And I think COVID-19 presented us and still presents us with so many situations that we don't have the resources to deal with really, or that stretch and exceed our resources, which is when we have to fall back on coping. So there's, I guess, two mental processes. So could we make the chat box thinner? Okay, yeah, absolutely. I will put the chat away from now and I'll check it periodically. Okay, so coping is a process that has two mental, we can unpack it in two mental processes. The first is just kind of appraising or assessing is this event that's happening going to threaten my well-being? Do I have the resources to deal with it? If I don't have the resources to deal with it, basically it is a stressor, something that will introduce stress. And then coping just basically means like, how can I reevaluate this stressor, this challenge, and how can I resolve the situation? If that works, my coping has been successful. If it doesn't work, it kind of goes into this cycle and we kind of reappraise it. And if we don't successfully find a way of dealing with this challenge that exceeds our resources, we are going to have, you know, chronic stress with associated ill health. So the pandemic introduces unprecedented challenges for us all. I'm just going to talk about an experience that I had, which will hopefully unpack this theory a little bit. So I think it was a Monday and I needed to teach on Tuesday, and on Monday morning I wasn't sure whether I was going to be teaching in the lecture theater the next day or whether we had to do online. And I think like somewhere late in the evening, I found out you need to start teaching online tomorrow. So obviously that like stretched my resources, or I felt not in control of that situation and I felt stressed. So the coping kicks in is when you start thinking, now how do I change this troubled relationship? How do I regain control? If not, you know, chronic stress, and probably for the rest of the term, which is going to diminish my sense of well-being. I'm just checking the chat. Okay, so I think that's all fine now with the chat box, which is gone. So I'm going to introduce 3 different kinds of coping, and I'm going to introduce how the arts can help us with these 3 different kinds of coping. So problem-focused coping is basically you try and change the situation which is causing the stress. Emotion-focused coping basically means that I know I can't change it, but I'll try and maybe not think about it, or I'll try and feel different about it. And then meaning-focused coping is like, I'm just going to have to try and live with this. I'm just going to have to give this a place and accept it. So I'm going to be talking about all of these 3. So problem-focused coping is often considered to be the most desirable form of coping, but it's not always available to us. But let's talk about it. It's efforts to manage the problem that is causing this stress and to actually change the relationship or change something in your environment that is causing stress. So it's doing something about it. So that means that you need a certain kind of mental agility. You know, it's task-oriented, situation-specific. You need to kind of do things. You need to find solutions to resolve the underlying problem. So let me unpack that with my example. So I need to start teaching online tomorrow. I feel stressed because, like, how do I do this? So if I fall back on problem-focused coping, I can think like, what can I do? What do I have the resources for? In my case, it was just, you know, the university had information about how to set up a live stream, and that helped me to cope with the situation. It wasn't perfect, but it did help me to cope. So what does that have to do with the arts? Obviously, problem-focused coping depends on you being able to find solutions in very stressful situations. So it depends on a kind of mental agility, which we can stimulate, I will argue, through engaging with the arts. And also, I'm going to be talking about the role of positive emotions. And here I want to also raise something, you know, a crucial idea is that we shouldn't just focus on creating art. The all-party parliamentary group was also saying that currently we're actually undervaluing arts appreciation, which might, you know, be going to a museum, going to a stand-up comedy show, watching a film. Is also things that we can harness. And I'm going to argue that they can indirectly help us with problem-focused coping. Okay, I'm just going to show you a little video clip that is going to ask you to do a little puzzle. But this is, you know, it's going to maybe indicate that maybe we can find sources of mental agility in the arts where we didn't even expect that it would be.
So let me illustrate that step with a task which is called mental rotation. Mental rotation is a task where I'm going to ask you, and again, you're going to do the task, to look at this shape, study it. It's a target shape. And I'm going to present you 4 different shapes. One of these 4 different shapes is actually a rotated version of this shape. I want you to tell me which one. The first one, second one, third one, or fourth one? Okay, I'll help you. Fourth one. One more. Get those brains working, come on. That's our target shape. Third, good. This is hard, right? Like, the reason I asked you to do that is because you really feel your brain cringing, right? It doesn't really feel like playing a mindless action video games. Well, what we do in these training studies is people come to the lab, they do tasks like this one. We then force them to play 10 hours of action games. They don't play 10 hours of action game in a row. They do distributed practice, so little shots of 40 minutes, several days over a period of 2 weeks. Then once they're done with their training, they come back a few days later and they're tested again on a similar type of mental rotation task. So this is work from a colleague in Toronto. What they showed is that initially, subjects perform where they're expected to perform given their age. After 2 weeks of training on action video games, they actually perform better. And the improvement is still there 5 months after having done the training. That's really, really important. Why? Because I told you, we want to use these games for education or for rehabilitation. We need to have effects that are going to be long-lasting.
All right, so yeah, playing video games is not as mindless as maybe some people might think, and it might really be a source for mental agility. Is problem-focused coping similar to reframing? I'm going to address that in the next section. I think reframing is more emotion-focused coping, so let me get back to that. So we talked about, I guess, engaging with arts like video games can stimulate our mental agility, which is something that we then can draw on in those situations where we need to find solutions. Now, something else is that positive emotions, so this is the broaden and build theory, is that experiencing positive emotions broadens your thought action repertoire. So that means like your resources to think about what you should do in that particular moment. And it builds that actually for the future. So having positive emotions in your life might be something that you're able to draw on in moments of stress when you need to think about a solution, and basically, I guess, broaden your field of what to do. And I think the arts are such a great resource for experiencing positive emotions. I'm just going to refer to an idea from one of my colleagues here at the University of Kent, is that you can even love a work of art. You can go to a museum or you can read a book, and you can truly even experience feelings of love. And this is one of those very strong positive emotions that you can draw on in times of stress to kind of find solutions. So the arts are an indirect resource for problem-focused coping. Where there's a situation that exceeds your resources, you're going to try and change that situation. I mean, the arts aren't going to change that situation, but they might help you to stimulate the kind of cognitive faculties to help you deal with that situation. Okay, so if anybody has any kind of questions or thoughts, I'm going to be talking about reframing next in the next category. Okay, I'm just going to move on. I'm going to check the chat box after I've talked about emotion-focused coping again. So problem-focused coping is changing the situation, and I guess emotion-focused coping is dealing with it. It is, I guess, reframing it, as somebody suggested in the chat box. It is changing the way you think or feel about it. So you're going to get a different emotional reaction to it. The situation is going to be the same, but you're going to feel different about it. So it's aimed at, ameliorating negative emotions. An important warning about emotion-focused coping is that it's usually considered to be a less good form of coping than problem focused coping. But we need to be really careful here, because emotion focused coping is something that we can draw on when actually nothing else can be done. Like, for example, if you've went for a job application, you did the interview, and now you have to wait, there's nothing you can do in that situation. So rather than constantly thinking about it, you can kind of think of ways of distancing yourself, thinking about something else, which needs to be distinguished from kind of escapist behaviors. And in the literature, like drug abuse and alcoholism are associated with emotion focused coping, but obviously those are very, very different things than, for example, using the arts as a way of taking your mind off things. That's one thing. We can take our mind off things. That is going to help us, I think, to experience positive emotions, so we won't think about it anymore. Now then you might say, well, the situation then is never going to be resolved. But you could think about it in another way as well. Engaging with the arts, experiencing positive emotions might help to recharge your batteries. Quite literally, you know, in the literature, we see this argument about positive emotions help you, you know, restore and sustain your resources. So after a really long and difficult day at work, it might be good just to unwind with the arts, and you might do that already, but know that this is actually going to help you as well to restore your resources to then, you know, tackle the situation when you can do something about it. So I'm going to be talking a little bit more about these two things. If I bring it back, and I think, you know, this might sound a little bit basic, but I think it's good to know that, you know, that there is academic literature which supports that, you know, if you don't have the resources to deal with something, you know, at the moment, I'm not entirely sure at all what my teaching will look like in September, but I can't change that at the moment. I need to wait for somebody to give me the information, but I can try and change how I feel about this, like not thinking about it all the time. And I think engaging with the arts, putting my mind of it, can help me. And as an indirect bonus, it might help me to restore my mental agility to then tackle the problem and the situation when I can. So one concept that I'm going to introduce here, and some of you might know it, for some of you this might be new, but this is the concept of flow. And, you know, when you're experiencing flow, you're basically engaging in an activity and you're in the zone. You're completely absorbed and interested. So whatever happens around you, you forget about it. So you might be in a really, really stressful situation, but if you're able to kind of generate a status of flow, you're going to be able to take your mind off that. And this is really, really powerful. And it's to do with tasks which are just right for your skill level. If it's too easy, it'll be boring. And if it's too hard, it's going to cause stress. So let me unpack that just a little bit more for you. So I play football. I'm an amateur football. And, you know, it's kind of chasing glimpses of flow. Most of the time I feel worried when I play football that, you know, my skills are not high enough and that the opponents will be stronger and faster. So sometimes, you know, I go into a game, I feel a little bit worried. Sometimes it might go into full-blown anxiety if, and sometimes this happens, you might be surprised about how much violence and aggression there is in amateur football leagues, or maybe this doesn't surprise you. But sometimes, you know, you go into kind of senses of anxiety. Now, very occasionally, we play a team and we win 10-0 or 16-0 very occasionally. And then it's just boring because the challenge isn't high enough. Now, sometimes moments of flow happen. And just from me, from personal experience, when I was in high school, I didn't have a very good time. And I remember a moment when I think a class was cancelled, which was already a win. And we were playing football, and it was just the right challenge for my skills, and I was experiencing a sense of joy and happiness in that moment. And I remember saying, I really like football. And that's just because it came easy and natural, because the challenge met my abilities. And I think this is kind of the sweet spot that is something you can try and look for in your life to, I guess, distance yourself and shield yourself from situations that at the moment you actually can't do anything about, and which you might lose sleep over. So it's being really focused, it's kind of losing yourself in the situation, forgetting about the time, and it's also something that is intrinsically justified and intrinsically rewarding. So again, in the all-party parliamentary inquiry, they were talking about Andrew Marr, the political commentator who was recovering from a stroke, and he was really getting into painting and forgetting about the pain and being so involved in it. So now I'm going to talk about how we can use the arts as resources for flow, to get this kind of focused attention, which just happens because we're engaging in a task that really matches our skill, even if it's objectively quite a difficult task. So crafts like crocheting, walking, you might get really into the zone, walking, gardening, cooking, and then stuff like playing Candy Crush. Games, as an example of art, especially these kind of casual games, they're really designed as artifacts, as objects. They're designed to create flow, which is why they can, get a little bit addictive sometimes. They're fun, not because they're, not because they're easy, but because they are the right kind of challenge for our mind, the right kind of challenge for our brain. It's easy to learn to play games like Jewel Quest is basically an old version of Candy Crush. It's easy to learn, but it's actually quite hard to master. And I think what's interesting about games like Candy Crush, and I think all games, is that as you progress through the levels, they get more difficult, but that's because you're getting better at it. And so it's really great games are really great to get flow because they constantly update the challenge to match your skills. Just as an aside, this is actually what NHS recommended, or partly what among the 10 things that NHS recommended that we should do to cope with COVID-19 is that we shouldn't stay glued to the news. We need diversion. And I think flow experiences are perhaps the most strong source of diversion that we have, and they also keep our mind active. And this is really important. You can't really experience flow if there is no challenge. And I think that we can turn to arts and even entertainment to achieve these kinds of flow. Here's a critical note. So sometimes in the literature, people will refer to, you can achieve flow states when you're actively engaged in something, which is true. So think about gardening, walking, but then not passively watching TV, as if, watching television is passive. And here's something that, somebody who's a film and television scholar, is that I want to put some pressure on this. We need to abandon the idea that there is such a thing as passive media engagement. You might think about Hollywood films, that people who watch Hollywood films are inactive or disengaged, but if they were, they would be bored. It's not rocket science, but it is offering them a kind of challenge which matches the skills in those moments. For example, a mystery television show. On the right, I've got a map of a German television show on Netflix, which is called Dark. And this is people trying to figure out how everybody in the show is related to each other. So this is like a really complex family tree. I think Dark is such a complex series that it is a bit of an outlier. But think about a normal detective show, kind of whodunit. You're trying to figure out what happened, who did it. You introduce hypotheses. The show is, introducing red herrings. Oh, it's not going to be that person because, it's never the first suspect. So our minds are active, and we enjoy this activity. We want to find out for ourselves. If you're interested in a television show and you're following it and you want to find out what happens, well, it's really easy. Go to Wikipedia, and you'll find it there. But we don't want that. We avoid spoilers because it's an activity that we engage in for fun. We want to try and puzzle it together. And because it's usually an activity that's pitched just, you know, to our skills to enjoy in a comfortable way and helps us to achieve flow. So active engagement with the arts is an obvious source for flow. I mean, by which I mean like actively creating things, actively producing, making art, but also just art appreciation and other kinds of arts beyond, you know, making it yourself can be really valuable sources for flow. So this brings me to the summary of, you know, the second kind of coping, emotion-focused coping, where I can't change the situation at the moment, but I'm trying to feel different about it. I'm trying to distance myself from it. So here we can use the arts as a direct resource, and we have the added bonus that when you're experiencing flow, it is a state of positive emotion. And as we saw previously, we can draw on positive emotions as a kind of restorer or replenisher of our resources to divert towards problem-focused coping when the opportunity arises. Okay, I'm going to talk about meaning-focused coping. I'm just going to check the chat now to see if there are any questions. Yeah, people talk about singing. Yeah, it's great to hear that people are already drawing on the arts to achieve a sense of flow. And I think, yeah, indeed, like when we're not able to do this, and I think this is, you know, we might be able to, COVID has represented real challenges for what we usually do. So what we usually do to achieve flow, for example, going out in the world, taking photographs, is something that we can't do at the moment. So we might have to look at different alternatives, and, you know, maybe Netflix might help or something else. Okay, I'm going to move on and talk about meaning-focused coping. And this is kind of like when all else fails. And originally in this model of coping, that meant a situation of chronic stress, but that didn't seem right. You know, it's, you know, there's a situation which exceeds my resources, and try as I might, it will still exceed my resources. That doesn't mean we have to be chronically stressed. It might just mean that we have to accept it. We have to be able to put it in perspective. It might mean that we draw on beliefs that we have, or values, or existential goals to be able to accept it. So if I unpack this a little bit more, you know, the example of myself as a teacher, I don't know what teaching is going to look like in September. I don't have the resources, you know, and, you know, I can draw on stoicism, and I think, you know, it could always be worse, which might really be helpful in this kind of situation. Or I might think about my values as a teacher to give it a place. Or I could try and see the funny side of it. So here I'm going to try and introduce comedy and comic storytelling as a way of meaning-focused coping, and that is going to really propel us now to stories for the rest of the webinar. The cartoons of Christine Jane Wilson, who's a cartoonist whose work is at the University of Kent in the British Cartoon Archive. And she was a self-identified cross-dresser in the 1980s, when it was, I mean, even much more difficult to be a trans person than it is today. And she talks about how she felt shame and guilt about being different, and it was something that was causing her lots of mental distress. And, you know, the cartoon that we see here is a kind of situation of social exposure, which is the kind of situation that would create a lot of stress and anxiety and is a real worry. But she said, you know, the funny side would hit me, and if I would be able to laugh about it, it would be less bad. I would be able to kind of feel less despondent. And this is to do with the way humor and comedy works, and can think about it as a cognitive shift. It can shift the way we assess a situation which otherwise causes anxiety. Because when you find something funny, it can't be threatening. In the sense that we usually find something funny when something unusual happens. But things which are unusual can also frighten us. For example, if a bomb goes off, that is unusual and it would frighten us. But if something like really unexpected and weird happens, but it's not threatening, it could be funny. So unless you're a fan of Donald Trump who feels threatened by his representation as a baby, you might be able to kind of laugh about it. And I think this is a real key idea, is that if we are able to reframe a situation by laughing about it, we might be able to kind of take out some of the anxiety. So comedy can be a tool in storytelling to put an unavoidable conflict in perspective and help us to come to terms with it. And this is what we're now going to explore further, not particularly the comedy aspect, but as one example. But we're going to now move on further to storytelling. And storytelling can also contribute to this kind of meaning-focused coping, that giving things a place, accepting it, which is, I think, an important thing that we have to do in this situation, is just accept it, or accept some things. And I'm going to talk about how stories give us a grip on disruption. So this is a bit about how stories work, and I think hopefully you've already got some kind of concrete ideas about coping, but I think this is going to be the part of the webinar where we start thinking about, like, how do stories help us cope with COVID? So just as a reminder, right, we talked about well-being involving realizing one's full potential, or personal growth, or professional ambitions, and how COVID disrupts that. So it's like, how can we use stories to get a grip on this? Stories have always helped us to get a grip on the world. We've told, in the history of humanity, what is thunder? Well, it's actually Thor and his hammer, which helps us to cope with something really frightening. The great religions, the great mythological systems, they're all based around stories, which introduce concepts that help people make sense of the world. And narratives still shape our world. Disney, for example, we all kind of know virtues and vices that we might have picked up from Disney films, and they're often still the same narratives, like Hercules. That's an ancient myth. So these kind of stories, they keep being told to help us make sense of the world. So let me just very quickly run you through what is the key message of The Lion King, just to get you a sense of how this might work. And it's like, listen to your parents, face your responsibilities, protect the community, or else. So when we talk like The Lion King, it's the prophecy. Simba is, the light is shining on him. Everybody's bowing in front of him. The light's shining on him again, and he's called The Lion King. This is Hollywood. They show it to you 3 times, but you should know that this little lion is destined to become the king. His father tells us, all of this is ours, just don't go there. And it's like, children, listen to your parents. But he doesn't listen to his father, and he gets seduced. And in the Disney universe, if you don't listen to your parents, you get into trouble. But his dad comes and saves him. But he still hasn't learned his lesson. And this time he's in danger again. Dad comes to rescue him again, but we all know how that ends. This is quite a really traumatic event. So Simba has made an error, which has killed his father, and then he kind of goes into exile. And it's very, very, very biblical here in this sense, going through the desert. He's running away from his guilt and his responsibilities, Hakuna Matata. All the while, the kingdom suffers, while he's just having a great time. So he's running away from his responsibilities. And then in the third act, Rafiki says, you need to kind of come back. You need to face up to your responsibilities. If you're not there, the community suffers. So he needs to repent for his sins. He needs to kind of go through these thorns as a kind of period of atonement. he looks up in the sky. You know, it's really all quite biblical. He's guided by his father. He gets rid of the evil. There's a period of cleansing. He has to kind of mimic again this process of repenting and then going back up. And you know, Disney isn't subtle about these things. The kingdom flourishes again, and you know, at the end, they've made place for a sequel as well. So this is a children's narrative, but you can really see how it is trying to make sense of the world and what we ought to do. Now, it's not just kids. You know, narratives also shape the worlds of adults in really significant events. I think before COVID-19, you know, September 11 was probably the most significant event of the 21st century. And the most powerful man of the time was using stories to make sense of it.
We'll smoke him out of their holes. We're gonna smoke him out. Smoke him out and smoke him out of his cave. Let's rush him and smoke him out.
So it's almost like it is a Western, you know, it's like a sleazy B Western, The War on Terror, which features the marshal and the outlaw. But what George Bush is doing is drawing on Westerns to actually shape our understanding of one of the most disruptive events, you know, for Americans. And he's kind of drawing on these ideas of, you know, civilization versus wilderness, hero versus villains, to make sense of what's going on. So let's try and unpack this a little bit more about how stories are used to make sense of the world, including profound disruption like September 11. So what makes a story a story? So I'm just gonna open the chat here if you want to share. Is this a story? You know, it talks about events which have happened not so far from here. It's all about Kent. You can also unmute yourself if you want to, you know, just say what you think, but is this a story? So we've got somebody that says yes. Maybe some other people sit on the fence. So I'm not sure that it is a story. It seems like a list of events, but these events aren't really connected with each other. It's like Theodore was ordained bishop, King Egbert gave reculver to somebody. It's not entirely clear what the connections are between these events. So what this is like a chronicle. It doesn't try and make sense of anything. It doesn't try and make sense of what life was at this time. It's just actually a list of events so we could identify which year it was. Now, if you think back about The Lion King, is that this was like a real chain of events which happened and they had a clear connection. Here we don't really have this clear connection between these events, so we don't really have any kind of sense of meaning. So a story is typically, you know, events which happen, you know, causes and effects which happen. So if you think about something like The Shining, he becomes a winter caretaker, which is a cause, which means that he stays at a hotel for several months. Unexplained paranormal forces are a cause, which make him go insane, and because he goes insane, he tries to murder his family, and then he gets stuck in the snow and freezes to death. So it's kind of all causes and effects, you know, in space and time. So this is really quite important when we think about how we can use stories. Stories, they connect events with each other. And it's because they connect events with each other, usually causal, cause and effect, that we get meaning, right? So in My Darling Clementine, which is the film I took some images from in, you know, the George Bush versus Osama bin Laden, the outlaws steal the cattle, the hero becomes a marshal, and he kills the outlaws. It's because we got this connection that we get meaning, you know, because they rustle the cattle, they're savages. The law will defend us and justice is served. And this is the same thing that George Bush was tapping into. He's trying to tap into this sense of story structure to create meaning that, you know, the Al-Qaeda are savage and we need to defend civilization. For causality, when we think about stories and when we're going to start thinking in the final bit of the webinar about our own stories, we kind of think about connections between events. They're usually cause and effect. Sometimes they're other kind of connections. So in The Lion King, for example, you can see that Mufasa, or that the adult Simba looks very much like his father. So if you didn't know yet that he is destined to follow in the footsteps of his father, there's another clue. And here, of course, other relations like oppositions. Mufasa is in the light and Scar is in the dark, good versus evil, and that's kind of mimicked later on in the film as well. So what I'm trying to get on across here is that stories, they connect events with each other, and that's how they create meaning. So professionals can make media like The Lion King, but we ourselves can also create narratives. I can, send my parents a message. Dear mom and dad, I'm having a great time in Magaluf. I made a lot of friends, and we bought beer together and we got really drunk. Small little story. You can also just, create stories for yourself, but you don't even need like a physical vessel to have a story. You don't need to have like something material. You can just like think through a story, and we often think in stories. We might not know it, but we think in stories a lot of the time. So we use memories about the past and what happened in the past and how we're going to plan for the future. For example, in the context of our professional lives and like how we got here before COVID and where we're going to go now, we don't necessarily need to tell anybody that. We can think through that. But I think what I want to highlight here especially is that we often think through that in narrative terms. It's like a story. And if we know that we're doing this, if we know that our thinking about our progress, what we want to achieve, and how this is going to kind of lead to personal growth and well-being, we use stories to think through that. So if you kind of have a better sense of how stories work, I think we can be more efficient there. So, okay, stories help us make sense of the world. They connect events, and that's how they kind of help us get a grip on disruption, because disruption is something that is a force which is something we find very difficult to deal with. So if you can try and kind of make a story about it that helps to make sense of it, we'll get a grip on it. And we tell stories. A lot of our thinking is narrative. So if storytelling comes natural and it's a tool for getting a grip on disruption, then how can we use stories in the context of COVID? So I'm now going to enter the last bit of the webinar. If you've got any questions at this stage or any kind of thoughts, just share them. But we're now going to get into the last bit where I'm going to talk a little bit about kinds of stories, I guess, that we could tell about COVID. Okay. What story are you going to tell about COVID-19? And how are you going to tell it? And maybe how should you not tell it? So I'm going to introduce here the concept of an illness narrative. So it's a narrative, people who have to deal with illness in their life, and that might be because you're ill yourself or you have somebody, a loved one, that is ill. You can try and deal with that by making a story about it, which kind of tries to get a grip on it and get a sense of control on a situation which is really difficult. And I think COVID-19 is obviously an actual illness, but it's also, I guess, a symbolical illness which threatens the well-being of organizations, of businesses, of professional careers, even if you don't literally have the virus. I think an interesting idea as well, and I think this is partly why I talk you through The Lion King, is that the stories that we tell about ourselves, about our place in the world, about where we want to go in our professional lives, and about our achievements, like, we don't get these stories out of thin air. Often we kind of draw on cultural models, by which I mean, like, if you've watched a lot of Disney films when you grew up, there is a very strong possibility that that is going to inform the way you think through some stories. I want to kind of refer here as well to narrative medicine, which is a program which was developed at Columbia University in New York. And it's basically the idea that it is part of medical education. So people studying to become doctors. And to put it bluntly, it's about letting people read books, letting doctors read books so that they become better listeners, so that they become more attentive to what's happening in the stories that their patients are telling them. So it's the same, you know, the idea that we use the same kind of skills to decipher what's going on in the story when we read a book, and if you're a clinician, you know, when a patient comes into the room. Now, I think we can transpose that idea not just from, you know, that's not just the case, I think, in clinical context, but also in professional context. So colleagues might talk to you, if you're in a kind of managing position with your employees, they might, you know, talk to what's going on, and they might not explicitly say what they're going through, but if you become more attentive to the way people tell stories, you might get, you know, you might be able to interpret what remains unsaid as well. So you can, I guess, in that sense, use the arts as a resource, as a training resource to learn about the experiences of others and the way they are communicated, and I guess to develop a sense of empathy as well. And, you know, this brings me back to the point I made in the beginning, that when we talk about well-being, it's holistic. It's not just about myself, but it's about other people in the organization as well. And I think you can't just see the well-being of the individual as independent of the well-being of the larger organization. So it's not just about yourself. So I guess like empathy and becoming attentive to others, I think, is really important as well. I'm just going to show you this clip because it's from a very powerful movie called A Separation. And this is a movie that we show to our students in our film studies program. And I'm just showing it because it had a profound impact on me, you know, when I saw it the first time. And there's this scene, this Iranian man, Nader, who needs to take care of his father who has dementia. And it just kind of reminded me, you know, about the mortality of my own parents. I'm just kind of sharing this as just an indication of the kind of powerful experiences that the arts can give us, and how, you know, they use stories to really, you know, try and make sense of very, very disruptive moments in our lives. Here again, it's kind of about the indirect value of the arts, is that, you know, engaging with the arts might increase your empathy, and you might think, what does that have to do with like professional context and organizations? But, you know, the point is that, you know, organizations are made up of people are going through extremely difficult times. And, you know, I was talking to a colleague yesterday who's got a father who's living abroad, who's got cancer, and my colleague is not able to be with her father, who's obviously in a really difficult situation. That colleague is obviously part of my team, and I think, you know, becoming attentive of these kinds of things which are going on in people's life is, I think, really important in this context. And I think the arts are an invaluable resource to kind of develop those skills. So some people are, like Rita Charon, who pioneered narrative medicine, are really very optimistic about narratives, about stories that, you know, they don't just help doctors to heal people, but they're actually part of the healing process itself. And I think that is a very, very strong idea and a very fruitful idea. But I think, you know, we need to still be a little bit cautious as well. And I think one thing, and this kind of brings me to what story are we going to tell about COVID, and maybe like what should we avoid? Their stories also have a danger. Stories have a danger that they might try and give coherence and make sense of everything, and that at the end we've got a happy ending and, you know, closure. And I think what COVID-19 has done for a lot of us, it's like showed us that life doesn't always work like that. And if we always assume that there's going to be a happy ending, or that we need to have a happy ending, otherwise kind of it's a failure, or then I think we're going to put undue stress on our well-being. And I'm just going to kind of give an example of, so I've got BoJack Horseman here. I was talking to my film students. So my third-year film students who are now graduating after 3 years of university, which is obviously a significant achievement in their lives. And I think it's, you know, part of their well-being, you know, part of what they want to achieve, professional growth, personal ambitions. And that comes usually with the graduation ceremony. And I think especially in films, we've come to really expect these graduation ceremonies and people throwing hats, and this wasn't possible for them. And I think this is one way in which media like films and the way these stories were told were actually imposing almost a way graduation should be, which was suffocating for students. And it was almost like as if they hadn't achieved because they couldn't do that. So I think my point is that we should be mindful of the way stories influence us, and that the stories which are out there might not always have structures which are realistic in our lives. And I think that when we think about our well-being and our achievement, yes, it's kind of a goal, but I think we should maybe think about other endings than just the happy ending, because otherwise that just doesn't feel realistic, and it's going to set us up for failure, I think. So in Hollywood cinema especially, and other kind of stories, there's always some disruption, something that goes wrong, but usually that's just like an obstacle, a prelude to a happy ending in the end. I think we're living through times of profound uncertainty where we're actually not entirely sure that there is going to be a happy ending. And I think if we are going to tell stories which impose that there ought to be a happy ending, we might give ourselves undue stress. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we should think pessimistically that there is going to be an unhappy ending, but I think that we maybe should not think about our stories as something that is very, very linear and that is going to go to a happy ending. We need to give a place for disruption, quite simply because we have to live with it, with COVID-19. You know, we have to find a way of kind of not denying it. And there's a philosopher called Jonathan Lear, and he has a really interesting idea. I'm not quite sure how practical it is, but I'm sharing it with you anyway. And he says, like, sometimes you have to have moments of not knowing what to do in order to reassess kind of what it is that you really want. And so COVID-19 has, I think, prevented us from doing what we're doing normally. And maybe there's some way we can think about this moment of disruption. Is like, okay, I can't do this anymore. What was again the reason why I wanted to do it so badly? And then you might find again a richer sense of why you want to do it, and that helps you to kind of reassess your personal goals and professional ambitions. Or you might come to think that, you know, maybe we need to do this different anyway because it's not exactly what we're after. I'm going to talk about, you know, this idea of achievement well-being, the idea of a seed which flourishes into a flower, and you know, realizing the potential which is in the flower. I think, you know, it is a journey. You know, I think it lends itself really well to this journey narrative or quest narrative. So we'll think about now concretely for the final moments of the webinar. We'll think about 3 concrete elements that will be part of any story I think that we are going to tell about COVID-19, our story, whether it's professional or personal. I think we'll have a plot, we'll have a character, and we'll have a form. And so we'll think about that a little bit more. In 2004, Christopher Booker published a book called The 7 Basic Plots, and the argument was that of all the stories in the world, actually the structure of those stories, there's 7 basic ones. Now, I'm not going to, you know, there might be 7 or 10 or 11. That doesn't really matter. I think the point is that a lot of stories that we engage with have underlying structures which are the same. And I think it is these underlying structures that we are also going to draw on when we tell our own stories about COVID. So I think Rebirth, for example, is The Lion King. Overcoming the Monster, I think, like, you know, Star Wars is a good example. Rags to Riches, Aladdin. I think you can probably think about lots of stories which are falling into this category. So I'm just going to open the chat for a quick question. This is a little story. I think, you know, what story is it telling? Or kind of what kind of plot? I'm just going to go back to the previous slide. So, Make America Great Again. Which of the 7 basic plots? I mean, it's one of the, as a marketing campaign, it's lost nationalism, yeah. It is a tragedy, yeah. But also I think this idea of lost, then, like somebody stole it, like overcoming the monster. Make America Great Again. Yeah, it could be the quest as well. Like, you know, we're on a quest. We're going to make it great again. Yeah. I think what's really interesting is that people are kind of mapping different kind of plots on it. I think maybe this is why it's so effective as well. I thought, you know, overcoming the monster, there's somebody who destroyed America, Obama, to get rid of everything he did, will get another place. But I think the strength of this narrative is that we can, or of this slogan, is that we can kind of interpret it in different ways as well. I think that's why it's so powerful. I think the overcoming the monster narrative has been very strong and very strongly distributed in the COVID-19 crisis. And I think people who work in the NHS have gone through you know, tremendous ordeals. I think we can think about the fact that if we're saying that these, you know, the hero narrative and overcoming the narrative might actually be obscuring certain hardships, or might be kind of obscuring certain structural deficiencies in the system and kind of putting it on the individual to do it. So we need to think about, like, is the hero narrative even like a healthy narrative? And this is kind of what I want to think about. I'm not sure if we should talk about overcoming the monster in our COVID-19 stories. Maybe it's just something we can talk about in the discussion. But there is research about, you know, what kind of stories people tell about their personal growth that are associated with higher degrees of well-being. So people who tell these kind of stories are associated with higher well-being, and it's being able to transform those. You know, if you have an experience which is difficult and you make a story about it that is about, like, I was able to learn something about it, or gain new insights, or I kind of was able to kind of get something positive about it as a transformative experience, is something that is associated with higher well-being, and especially the kind of, you know, redemption narrative or rebirth, or it's kind of, this is a challenge, but we kind of came out it. And I think this might be a useful structure to think about, you know, how we are going to tell stories about COVID-19. Maybe we can, you know, watch films that have redemption stories to kind of train ourselves doing that. Okay, we're near the end now of the webinar. A story obviously need a character. We need to be a hero. You know, I'm not entirely sure that we need to be a hero. I think Dave in the group chats already kind of indicated that it might not be such a great idea. I think, you know, it's really tough being a hero all the time. So this is from a cartoon called The Boondocks by Aaron McGruder, and the protagonist Huey is somebody who has, you know, tremendous zeal to try and change the world, and I guess he wants to be a hero, and he's constantly defeated because he sets himself very unrealistic goals. And, you know, he talks about, you know, I want to change the world, you know, that's what I want to do. And so, yeah, you're doing that, and you're constantly miserable. And I think it's this idea about setting yourself realistic goals. I think a hero is somebody that can do things which are beyond realistic. And I think if we need to think of ourselves as heroes, we might get into real trouble, real psychological trouble. Neurotic perfectionism is a kind of mental illness or strain on our mental well-being, where we constantly set ourselves inaccessible goals, and that means that we're kind of never satisfied with what we're doing, and we're constantly guilty and shameful. So I think whatever story we're telling, I'm not sure that we need to tell a story about the hero is going to win what's never been won, because I think that is going to be really detrimental to our well-being. And there is again evidence in the literature that a sense of well-being involves self-acceptance, accepting that you're not perfect, accepting, I guess, that you're not a hero. I'm going to show this video clip, which is again like a source. It's interesting to see how people relate to, and you can see this here at the bottom, how we relate to characters from a show. So this is Chidi. He's a deceased ethics professor in a show called The Good Place, and he always wants to make the right decision in life. He always aspires to be perfect. And let's see how that kind of works out for him.
A perfect utopia, and I have a stomachache. I don't know. Oh no! No! Oh, come on! That was a bad idea. That was so scary. So many different times. I hated that.
Hey, do you mind if I borrow Professor Stomachache here for a second? Chidi, I can see that you're worried.
Well, what do we do? Panic, freak? I usually panic, but I am happy to freak. Oh, stomachache. Exploring makes me nervous. I have what doctors call directional insanity. Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, oh. I once got lost on an escalator, so not exactly Christopher Columbus.
If you can't make a choice, this whole neighborhood could fall apart.
Please don't ask me that right now. This is awful.
We have fun, don't we, Chidi?
I've never been more stressed out in my entire life. I have a very bad stomachache. I am vexed, Tahani. Vexed. Oh no. Oh, no. Okay. No. I thought I'd have a stomachache right now, but weirdly, I do.
So often I think of myself as Chidi if I'm kind of prone to setting myself unrealistic goals. And it's like, I remind myself, like, I might even make a little bit of a story where I kind of think about myself as a Chidi and then think how actually I kind of need to adjust my expectations, because otherwise I'm going to kind of hit a wall. Okay, last thing. A story needs a particular kind of form. So we can tell stories in different kind of media, but stories also have kind of different kinds of forms. Like, a film is over, romantic comedy, 90 minutes. A sitcom, it's like 22 minutes or 30 minutes, and, resets every episode. I'm going to introduce this idea that maybe one useful way of thinking about our journeys to well-being is as a kind of serialized drama that kind of works towards an end, and endings are important, but it's not over in 90 minutes. It takes years, and I think maybe this is a good way of kind of thinking through stories. Now, endings matters. Just ask the people that make Game of Thrones. People weren't very happy with the ending, which had like a really big impact on the social recognition of the cultural recognition of the show. But obviously, like, achievement is an end, right? Is a goal. So I think the kind of stories that we're telling about our well-being, our stories which are kind of going somewhere, are kind of aimed at something. But I don't think we should think that it's a story that's, lasts 90 minutes. Let me just kind of get back to BoJack Horseman again. And it's this kind of idea of kind of longevity.
Oh god, lungs on fire. Ow, crap. I hate this. Running is terrible. Everything is the worst. Oh my god. Oh my god.
It gets easier.
Huh?
Every day it gets a little easier.
Yeah?
But you gotta do it every day. That's the hard part. But it does get easier.
Okay.
So I'm interested in this idea of like how many days you get to spend in the story. Every day it gets a little easier, but you know you could imagine like I'm thinking through this as like a montage. You know, after 22 minutes, oh yeah, it got easier in the end. But if we stick with these kind of characters for a really long time, we see their ups and downs, and this is something that was talked about in the reception of this show, and I think this is something that indirectly we can think about when we think through our own stories that we tell to deal with COVID-19. So you can think about the sitcom where when people usually, you know, introduce challenges in the sitcom, at the end of the episode they're overcome, and then everything starts back from the beginning in the next episode. So every kind of disruption that is introduced in a sitcom is resolved by the 22 minutes. If you think through stories about COVID-19 with those expectations, I think that is going to be really difficult. Instead, we can think like it's something that goes on for years in different kind of episodes. And I'm just going to tell you something personal. In the beginning of the pandemic, I was sometimes had like days in which I felt quite low and had a low mood. And actually for me, what was quite useful is to think about that this was just one episode. That, you know, in this episode, I'm going through a moment in my story where I'm low, but that doesn't mean that, well, it doesn't mean that it's going to be resolved in 22 minutes, but it's also like only a moment in this larger story. And I think this kind of sense of longevity might be really important. And it also kind of helps us to think through, like, it doesn't need to kind of be a neat, linear story from challenge, which is overcome, to achievement in 22 minutes. I think we can allow ourselves to tell stories which are told over a period of time and which can kind of go in different directions, which is important in processes of recovery, which are not orderly. Okay, that's it. I think, you know, this kind of this idea of thinking through ourselves in different periods, where we came from, where we're going to. And I think this kind of idea of a story that is told in installments, I think could be a really useful tool to think through. So hopefully some of the key takeaway ideas that we could still discuss in the discussion is that, you know, well-being involves a sense of achievement and goals. Stories can help us make sense of that well-being process by, you know, especially getting a grip on disruption. And, you know, we need to be mindful of the stories that we tell. You know, do we need to overcome the monster? Do we need to be a hero? And, you know, is this journey to well-being, is it an episode that's done in 22 minutes, or is it like a series that is told in longer installments? Okay, I'm at the end of my presentation, so thank you for listening. And if you've got any questions, we can have a chat about it.
So much with what you did there. That was tremendous. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus.
Yeah, I have one question in the chat from Lee. Is this a part of your research or just general thoughts?
It is part of my research. I've just written a book on satire, comedy, and mental health, which is going to be published in January. And a lot of that, especially the ideas about, you know, how we can adapt techniques from stories in our own lives, is something that is really central to the book and the research.
Anyone else have any questions? You can raise your hand, jump in, or add it into the chat.
I just want to say as well that people can always find my details online on the Kent University website if they want to send me an email. It's a lot of information as well to process in one go, so we'll send out the PowerPoint as well, and, you know, people can certainly take a bit of time to reflect, and if there's anything else, are very welcome to send follow-up.
I think it's fascinating, all the different strategies you covered, and how in some sense we're already doing this but not really identifying how we're doing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
With, for example, I can relate to that entirely, but I never really perceived it as a part of my well-being. It was just something I did. But when you break it down like that, I can now recognize actually that has a lot of value on my well-being, especially in the current climate.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, because I think, especially also when I was kind of talking through the section on coping, I think these are things that we we probably naturally do. I think indeed what I was trying to hope is that gives people some kind of reassurance and some clarity that, yeah, you know, you're actually doing the right thing, and, you know, you can kind of, here's reasons why this is like actually a great strategy of doing it. And I think, you know, by being more aware of these things, hopefully we become more efficient at harnessing those resources.
Absolutely. I'm also quite happy you mentioned video games stimulates brain activity. I took a screenshot of that and sent it to my wife already, so she can stop moaning at me spending too much time doing that now.
But I think also just like motor skills, that as well. I mean, my students constantly beat me at playing video games when we play that as well. But I think, yeah, video games is really interesting. I think if you were to say to somebody, I spend my Saturday morning reading a book, everybody say, oh yeah, well done. But it's like, I spend my Saturday morning playing a video game. It's like, but I think they are really valuable, in very many ways.
And if anyone has any other questions, feel free to put it in the chat or just jump in.
I was just sort of reflecting while you were talking about how we share our stories and which are useful stories to share, and I've had a lot of different stories. I'm keeper of social history actually at the Higgins, so I put a call out quite early on to ask people in the local community if they wanted to share their stories with us, and I left it very open how people might like to do that. Obviously most of the content I've received so far is all digital stuff because I'm still working from home, but I have been offered some physical diaries and things like that from people, from quite a broad range of individuals, like families, old people, some young people. Trying to get the ethnic diversity is always a bit of a challenge, but I've got links with different groups through our panels and stuff, so I've been trying to think about how best to do that too. But yeah, I think we've had a lot of poetry and spoken word. I had a lady just email me another instalment today around the coming out of lockdown, which has just been so interesting that she's like, oh, we've still got a way to go. It's going to be around for quite a long time yet. And I was thinking, yes, you know, it's still lots to transition for people. So it's been for me actually, it's been a real source of kind of, I suppose, like just for my own well-being. I found it quite uplifting listening to how other people have wanted to share their stories and how they've been coping with it, but I hadn't really thought about the mechanisms with which they were sharing them, so that's been really interesting. So thank you for all the kind of the processes, and there's lots of follow-up links and stuff I'm going to have a look at, so thanks very much. It's been
Thank you very much. I think it's really interesting. I think also what you're saying is that by sharing our stories about lockdown with others, actually that can be good for our well-being. And, you know, these kind of, I think, you know, we're not there yet, we still have a way to go. Those kind of stories might help actually frame our understanding, which I think is really important for our well-being. And so I think, you know, the stories that we tell to each other become resources. And I think it's this kind of, I guess this kind of idea of the hammer, right, that I think I was trying to get across early on, is that, if somebody tells you a story about what's going on in their lives, and you know, you might just think about something, oh, there's something I've heard, but not something that you could actively do something with. And I think with this kind of, you know, if somebody tells a story that resonates with you in the way they told it, it might be because the way they kind of plotted the story, you know, in sense of this idea, we're not there yet, we still got a way to go, but, you know, we've already made these kind of progress. That might be a kind of story structure that you might find useful to think through personally in your organization. And yeah, I think that's kind of what I wanted to say about this, is that we can actively adopt and adapt strategies from stories into our own stories. And we're doing this already, I think, by being more conscious that we're doing it. I think we can get, you know, achieve better well-being.
I was really interested in the way you were talking about, you know, looking at a story overall and what actually is a story, and when you had a sort of series of one-liners bolted together. And I think from a commercial sense, I think certainly the way that we as businesses can sometimes portray ourselves is those individual sentences. And I think that, you know, you're talking about how stories can get a grip on disruption and help you look at it kind of from a slightly further view, and you can look at it holistically as the whole package, and where are you heading and where are you going and what's happening and how you can make sense of all of that, especially right now in terms of COVID, but any disruption. I mean, disruption can come in many forms. You know, hopefully we won't see a pandemic like this again, but you know, there's all sorts of disruptions that can happen, certainly on the horizon.
But I think as well, like, why is Make America Great Again a fantastic marketing slogan, right? You talk about, you know, commercial businesses using slogans to, you know, position themselves in the market. You know, we can very easily apply that to the presidential campaign. It's because it tells a story. And I think, you know, what was interesting for me to see in, you know, what came back is that I think we all identified it as a kind of story, and maybe we even kind of thought of it as slightly different stories, which might be the reason why the slogan might appeal to different people for different reasons. But it has a very kind of, you know, it's one sentence, but it kind of evokes a kind of this process of narrative thinking, you know, like, you know, it kind of jolts something. And I think that narratives are such a, you know, powerful tool that have been with humanity for a really, really long time. And we use narratives and we fall back on them to make sense of the world. So, you know, politics are full of stories. And I think, yeah, if we can become more aware of them. And some of those stories which, like somebody was mentioning in the chat of maybe knowing people that work in the NHS that might think the hero narrative is unhelpful. I think is like, yeah, sometimes stories can cover things up. I think Make America Great Again is a really good example of that. Like, not all stories are the right stories, and stories can often kind of be damaging. They're really powerful tools. So I think, you know, it's being aware of them and therefore kind of putting them maybe to better use.
The only thing, and I don't have a political debate through this forum, but I have to say that really since Brexit, I've seen the UK government use a lot of slogans, especially through the pandemic. I think we've had 4 or 5, and very interesting as to every new thing that's happened, there's been a new slogan that's been attached to that, which again, I need to think more about how that brings forward an emotion in me around that particular thing, whether it's stay in and protect the NHS, or let's get back to the outside, or eat out to help out, whatever the latest one was. And I need to reflect on actually what those slogans are emoting in myself.
And I think what's interesting to think about is that how they might be informed by, you know, those narratives which are all around us in our culture, in our books, in our films, and you know what kind, you know, I think what they're going to be, the emotional effect that they're going to have is, you know, it might be the kind of emotional effect that you have when you watch Star Wars, because they're actually trying to do similar things like Star Wars. Not that necessarily one of those slogans that you mentioned is similar to Star Wars, but it's just kind of something that pops in my mind. And I think, so this idea, something that in my research I feel quite strongly about, is that, you know, the arts, they influence us in so many different ways that we're sometimes not aware that they're doing. And, you know, if we become more aware of them, I think, you know, we'll value the arts better, but I think, you know, we'll have, yeah, I think achieve better well-being as well.
Great, thank you.
Almost like there's multiple stories to tell as well. If you look at COVID, there's the environmental rebirth, there's the new focus on family. There is for me. I spend a hell of a lot more time with my family now, my kids, than I ever did before, and that's now a lot of focus for myself there. Also, the shop local story. I now go to the greengrocers, I go to the butchers, whereas once upon a time I would literally just go Sainsbury's or Aldi. So I think for everybody there's different stories on a larger scale, like the environment, all the way through to in your actual family circle surrounding this.
Yeah, it's interesting, this kind of shop local that is part of a rebirth, like kind of in a narrow sense of getting the economy going again, but also even kind of in a larger sense of, you know, maybe something that we've forgotten as a society. I mean, it's something I personally feel quite strongly about, because I have a family bakery in Belgium, so like small businesses is always something I care about a lot, and there's definitely kind of a narrative there of rebirth, maybe.
Yeah,
that is something that we feel strongly about.
I think it's very easy to focus solely on the negatives when you're seeing social media information, negative headlines in the news. But actually, there's a lot of positive coming from this rebirth. From, you know, I drive now from my house to Dover. I don't see litter cluttering all the roads because there's a McDonald's nearby because it's been closed for months. Like you said, going to the local shop now, I now have a relationship with my butcher, which 4 months ago I didn't know the guy, and now I chat to him every weekend when I go in there, all the way through to spending at least 2-3 hours more a day with my children from when previously I was commuting. So there's a lot of positive when you really think about stories, but it's almost they get overtaken sometimes. You kind of get caught up in a whirlwind of negativity when you're looking particularly at social media, but also headlines in the news and what have you.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think, you know, one way to protect ourselves to that is these kind of, you know, core skills that we associate with humanities, and it's interpreting the stories, you know, seeing what kind of techniques are being used to get messages across, and then making decisions for yourself and say, well, actually, I don't think this is the right story. You know, I think this story is actually misrepresenting what is really going on. There's a better story to be told. And I think that is also key to our well-being. And, you know, for example, I know exactly the kind of stories that you refer to. For example, somebody working in higher education, you know, every once in a while there will be a story in the news that is going, you know, higher education is in real trouble. And of course, you might internalize those stories. But I think the important thing is that, you know, there's other stories that you can tell about those same facts, you know, and that might be more truthful. And I think being aware of that is really important, because otherwise, you know, you can get stuck in a narrative where, and I think, you know, storytelling is a skill to really kind of break free from those oppressive, harmful narratives, you know, which are harmful for our well-being, in the sense that they might give us the impression that, yeah, forget about your goals. That's never going to happen, right? Forget about your achievements. I think that's not necessarily the case, and stories can really help us to think through that. And, you know, engaging with the arts, you know, it's learning from the pros, right? It's like professional storytellers being aware of what they're doing, I think, can be helpful in the kind of personal stories that we tell, or, you know, think through in our car as you come from Dover into work, and, you know, you're thinking about this. You don't even need to tell somebody for it to have a kind of impact in the way you shape the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
I did my first face-to-face meeting with some real people yesterday, which was super exciting. And actually I was meeting an artist we're working with on a project we're doing, but it was interesting because he was talking about this big black hole of energy that everyone is needing, you know, and how to get your energy back, and how we all need more energy to kind of get back to this new normal, whatever that's going to look like for each of us. But I thought it was really interesting, because I think what you've been talking about, in a way, in sharing those stories either personally with each other or broader, is a way of kind of, I suppose, making sense, as you were saying, to ourselves and to other people, but also getting some of that energy back. Because I think you were saying about the healing force of narratives and stories, and this regaining this sense of well-being. And I think that's what's really, I have noticed actually in the stories that have been coming to me, is that it's not just about the person sharing it, it's that acknowledgement that I give them in return about, you know, the response to that narrative, and also how we might do that more publicly in time, but also having that archive material for future generations. So, but yes, it's just an interesting situation we're in, where, yes, I think, you know, all the well-being activities, and it's brought so much more attention to mental health and well-being this whole period, hasn't it? It's been really fascinating how differently people have viewed being honest and open about how they're doing, how they're how they're expressing that. It's been really, really interesting times, really, from that point of view.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, this idea of acknowledgement, and I think this is indeed what Rita Charon, is partly saying, that if you're a patient and you go into a doctor, and you tell your story, I think you're going to have a very different kind of recovery process if you've got a sense that the clinician is listening to your story or not. And I think that's partly what she's talking about. And I think indeed what you talk about, and having the archive and getting a sense of recognition that these stories are acknowledged, I think is very important in our recovery for our well-being. And I think on an organizational level as well, being able to listen to stories of colleagues, and I think this point made in the literature, which I think is quite important, is that your subjective well-being can't really be fully divorced from what other people are going through in your organization. And I think moving forward, I can only speak for myself, so we are facing some really challenging times ahead next term, and as colleagues, as lecturers, we are going to, I think, have to acknowledge each other's stories, because we all have, a lot of us, including myself, have family that live abroad. Can be really difficult, and I think it's being there for each other. I think also means acknowledging each other's stories. I think that's something you said very well.
Any other questions from anyone? Cool. Well, thank you, Dita. Once again, that was absolutely amazing. I personally, speaking for myself, I found that really relatable, really interesting, and thank you once again.